Now, in preparation for splitting the cases, one of the first jobs I'll do is to remove the oil pump. And it's just the 3 cap heads. In this position, the stand is effectively the wrong way around, and it's not locking the angle, but it's absolutely fine. Partly I only got it angled like this for the benefit of the camera. That all together in a little tray. So now we've got to remove the oil pump gear retaining nut. Now this is the early style, which doesn't require a special tool. The later style is more like a bearing retainer nut with the notches around the outside, except these are a nylock style nut, and it's a fine pitch thread, so these are actually a special. So on these hexagonal ones, it's an M27 or 27mm across flats. The sockets fits fine. Ideally I would be using an impact socket, because I'm going to be using an impact driver to remove it. I don't have a 27mm socket. This is a fairly heavy wall socket, it's a Japanese one, and I shall be wearing goggles just to be on the safe side. Now there's a pinion holding tool, which I used to have a homemade version that I inherited. Unfortunately it wasn't terribly well made, and it snapped. So what I shall be doing instead is I'll simply refit a flywheel to the other end of the crankshaft, and then I can use the crankshaft holding tool, though to be honest I'm probably just going to hold this by hand and let the impact tool do the job. So I'll fit this on and then we'll have a go. Okay, I've now got the flywheel on the back, which I can grab hold of, and there we go. So now the oil pump gear will come off, and the reason for the fine thread, this gear is simply friction driven between the nut and the primary drive gear. Now we want to withdraw the primary drive gear and its key, and sometimes they will just slide off. They're a transition fit. This one's a little bit tight, so I've got a piece of plastic round to give me something to bear against with this stout screwdriver. And if I get myself lined up, there we go, that's coming off okay. Shift to the other side. In case it's just the not coming off quite square. I'm not trying to put any real force on it, just kind of guide it off. And there's a spacer ring behind it. Whilst I'm here, seeing as they're still in place, I'll remove the clutch bush, and there's a washer, special beveled washer that goes with it, and I'll put those with the clutch set. So we've got the engine turned around once again, and I'm going to remove the cam belt pulleys. Now the top one's very straightforward. Again, this is a tool I inherited with a previous bike that fits into the two holes in the timing pulley. Now these holes are cast, not machined, so they can be a little bit awkward to line up, and you might have to go in and open the holes up a little bit. So this should be very straightforward, and indeed it is. That's going to require me to get in there and lever that gently off. Now the pulley on the crankshaft requires a thick washer, and then you refit the circlip that held the belt guide washer. At some stage Morini started using locking compound to make sure that the pulley wasn't moving on the crank, and I have seen engines where the pulley had been fretting and had worn the crank. So we need to get this up to maybe a couple of 100 degrees to make sure we've broken any adhesive bond. Now I don't want to damage the centre hole in the end of the crankshaft, so I'm just going to impose a bit of scrap material between the two. And we'll see whether this wants to cooperate. That's about as much tension as I want to put on there right now. You can see that I've changed to a different puller, and I machined up a thicker washer than this one. This one was distorting, and if you let them distort too much, you can end up bursting the circlip groove in one place. So the new washer is as thick as it can be and still get the circlip on. What I've been doing is putting tension on, getting the pulley good and hot with the torch, and winding more tension on, and it is shifting. This is clearly a very tight pulley, and every time I get it hot, I can get it to move, and then it stops again. So, you know, I've got to create a temperature differential between the pulley and the crankshaft, and obviously the pulley's cooling down whilst the crankshaft's heating up, and I'm losing the clearance I've generated with the heat. So I then have to let the whole thing cool down so that I can hit it with the heat again and create that difference. With the handheld camera and zoomed in, you can see I've got clearance between the washer and the end of the crank, and that's how far the pulley has moved so far. So a good few more heat cycles and it's coming off. Let things cool down for a while, so let's give it another burst of heat. That moved a good chunk. And we're now moving every time. That has to be said, was one of the tighter ones I've come across. I'm pretty sure that this was one of the pulleys that have been put on with Loctite. There were lumps here and evidence inside the pulley that that was the case. Now you can see the rear guide washer for the belt has a keyway in it, so to get it off you have to turn it and line it up with the woodruff key in the crank, and then it's possible to take it off. Now that we have the cam pulleys off, there's nothing to stop us removing this right hand timing side case. Oh, by the way, now that there's no belts or anything in place, you can very clearly see the play in the main bearing. So there are a series of M6 cap head screws around the engine, so I'm going to go ahead and remove all those, and then we'll be ready to split the cases. I've now removed all of the outside bolts, so the 4 across the bottom. There's 1, 2, 3 here, and then there are now 2 internal bolts where the nuts are captive in the case. They've got a little hexagonal recess to hold them. There's one nut just rotate over and see what's going on with that nut. It's down that hole. Okay, I've got the bolt out, and both these screws have got a copper sealing washer under the head. This one looks like it's had a problem with the external side of the seal, and so there's the nut, and then this is some epoxy or something like that that's been put in this hole to seal it from oil coming through from the inside, meaning that the sealing hadn't worked. They modified later crankcases to incorporate an internal seal between the two halves. But on this one, you know, this side is all wet with oil, so you can get some leakage down under the head of that bolt over to obviously the outside. So now I'll put the engine in a near horizontal position, because I've got to take off the nuts holding both cases to the stand, because they're also obviously keeping the two cases together. We just barely finger tight. To separate the cases, we've got to obviously lever them apart in some means, and you never want to be doing this between mating surfaces if at all possible. Now fortunately Morini provided this gap. It's an extension to the surfaces, and there's a bit accessible up here, all along the bottom of the engine. And that does give us a place to lever, and I have a screwdriver that has been damaged at some stage, and it has a very wide tip from where it was reground, so we can actually just tap that in and encourage the centre seal to break. Okay, that's the seal broken all round, I think. So. At the moment we've got the gearbox outlet shaft is not wanting to slide through. It moved most of the way, and then I have to. Okay. Let's move this more vertical so I can see what's going on. So I think I probably forgot to clean the output shaft, and it's not wanting to slide through the bearings very easily. So we'll just give it a gentle tap with the copper mallet. That's going through. Very nearly there. There we go. Just a case of getting the alignments just right. There go the tappets. Quite usually the tappets would stay in the case, but these of course were so catastrophically worn they've just fallen out. So we've got a gearbox shim that we want to, so it's the shaft shim that we want to recover. There's no other shims hiding in the case. And there's a lot of nasty looking stuff down in the bottom of the case, but otherwise things are reasonably clean. So there's that surface that can leak oil through to the outside, that they changed that later to put a seal in it. now I can finish stripping the left hand case, I've got some plastic tubing here to clamp this case to the stand again now that the right hand case has been removed. So first thing to remove is the selector mechanism. So if you pull back the spring-loaded arms, that can just be removed as an assembly. The next thing that needs to come out is the gear cluster and selector drum, and in order to keep it together I'm going to fit pipe clamps onto the shafts, just relatively loosely. So this will take care of this end. There we go, and just ease the shafts forward all together. First gear needs to come with us. Actually, I'm just going to put everything a little bit more upright so that we're not losing gears off the back. So there we go, there's the complete cluster. There's a thrust washer here that we don't want to go missing, so that's where we'll put the clamp on the shaft, like so. I think I can see things in the camera, and keep it all safely together. Now this is the gear change stop plate, and the manual advises that you don't disturb this unless you have to. To readjust this plate correctly requires the use of a cutaway right hand case, or of a specially made plate to keep all the shafts in alignment whilst you adjust this. So generally speaking, don't disturb it unless there's a particular reason to. So the last job, of course, is to remove the crankshaft. So I've got a nylon dead blow hammer, and I'll use that to drive the crank through the bearing. Well, the crankshaft's not wanting to drive through the bearing very easily at the moment, so what I may do instead is to unscrew the bearing retainer plate. I can rotate the crank to gain access to all the screws, and then with the side case heated up, that bearing will just slip out. Well, what I did instead was I turned the frame through 90 degrees so I could get a better swing with the hammer, and then we were able to tap the crankshaft through with no problem at all. So that's the engine all apart, and now it'll be a case of cleaning everything and taking measurements